Welcome to the first segment of the Prepper Report, the first show in the entire nation dedicated exclusively to the subject of emergency preparedness. We look forward to bringing you experts on how to prepare for local, regional, national, and even global disasters. I'm Josh Wander, and I will be your host today for this segment. I must preface by stating that the likelihood of such a major catastrophe is low, but natural and man-made disasters happen every day around the world, so we think it prudent to prepare for such an eventuality. One of the most critical and often overlooked subjects of preparedness is that of communications. In a disaster situation, we need to be able to communicate with others. We need to have a source of information about what is happening outside our local vicinity and to transmit our status to others. This can be done for the purpose of requesting assistance from a friend or from an outside agency, or to pinpoint the location of victims and report on the extent of damage. Amateur radio, also known as ham radio, has consistently been the most reliable means of communications in emergencies when other systems failed or were overloaded. With us today is Larry Keller of Murraysville, Pennsylvania. Retired from the University of Pittsburgh, having served as the Director of Environment, Health, and Safety and a faculty member at the Graduate School of Public Health, he started in amateur radio at age 15 in 1958. His recent amateur radio activities include serving as a section emergency coordinator for Amateur Radio Emergency Services, ARES, the past president and current trustee of Skyview Radio Society in New Kensington, Pennsylvania. He's brought along with us two Pitt students, Jeff Wolf and Brian Cannon. Welcome. Thank you for coming to the show.
Thank you, Josh.
So, Larry, why exactly is ham radio relevant? In today's day and age of internet and iPhones, why do we need ham radio?
Well, ham radio is probably the only communication system that we have that is virtually uninterruptible. And it's uninterruptible for a couple of reasons. First, it's widely distributed. It's not interlinked and interdependent, such as the internet is, or cell phones, or our typical communication systems. And it's quite simple in its operation. To set up a ham radio station, you need a radio, a battery, and a piece of wire for an antenna. And with those three basic items, you can communicate either short distances, medium distances, or long distances, and very reliably.
Is it difficult to become a ham? What does that entail?
It's not as difficult as it used to be. There are 3 levels of license. The first is the technician class, and you simply have to pass a test of 25 questions and get 3/4 of them right, and that gives you privileges that are somewhat restricted to local area bands, although there is one band that is quite nice for the technicians to work with. The next level class is the general class, and that involves the theory and the regulations and courtesies and electrical knowledge that is required in the technician class, but also a little more sophistication because you're going to be using a lot more sophisticated equipment. The final and the highest class license is the extra class license. In the extra class license category, you have to demonstrate proficiency in radio theory, propagation of radio waves, and it's a fairly extensive test, and most amateurs view it as quite an achievement to become an extra class licensee. We have tests around the area, and anyone that's interested, we urge them to contact any ham that they know, or they can go to the American Radio Relay League on the internet, and that's ARRL.org, and there's a little radio button that says, so you want to become a ham, and it will direct you to people in your area that you can contact. And one thing characteristic of hams is they're always happy to find new people interested in the hobby to keep the hobby moving.
Well, do you need to know Morse code? Do you need to know anything? What do you need to pass one of these tests to get one of these licenses?
The Morse code requirement was actually dropped about 3 years ago. When I got my license, you had to demonstrate proficiency at 5 words a minute just to get a license, and then 13 words a minute to get the general class license. And then the higher class licenses required code speeds up to 25 words per minute. So that was a real barrier to a lot of people. Even people who were really technically oriented just couldn't get over that code barrier. But now that's been removed, and there is really a pretty reasonable test to get into that technician class. And there are kids that are 6, 7 years old that if they can read and memorize, they can probably pass the technician test, and they can do quite a bit, especially in emergency services. They can serve a lot of useful purposes.
Well, what unique role would you say does ham play in emergency services?
Well, emergency services or emergency communications has been part of ham radio for many, many years, since its inception, as a matter of fact. The American Radio Relay League has an organization within it that's called the Amateur Radio Emergency Services, or usually referred to as ARES. And ARES is now about 77 years old. And the objective of ARES was to place an amateur radio station in every community so that they could communicate in case of emergency. Now you can imagine that communications alternatives were pretty limited back 76 years ago. Pretty much the telephone and maybe a telegraph line was about it. Radio was really somewhat of a curiosity as far as a general kind of communication tool.
So, I mean, we have some things on the table here. A lot of people, when they think of communications, they're thinking possibly of an iPhone, or people that are a little older generation might think of a wired phone. But even people that are more sophisticated are familiar probably with little walkie-talkies or perhaps even a satellite phone. What do you have? What did you bring today?
Well, these, with the exception of the telephone there, share a common characteristic. They all have a radio in them. In other words, they're putting a signal out into the air that is essentially coded in a way that it can travel through the air and be decoded at the other end in the form of speech or some other type of a signal. The things that I brought here are some of the radios that we rely on in amateur radio, for example. Amateur radio has a very broad spectrum. In other words, there are a lot of different frequencies that we can talk on. And we generally talk about these things in terms of wavelength, and it's kind of, it just has to do with the distance that the wave travels. I'm not going to get into the technical side of things, but when you look at the communication systems that you talked about here, your cell phone, for example, or smartphone, it's a very short communication device. The wavelength, or the frequency of that cell phone is 900 megahertz, which means that it's not going to travel very far. That's why we have to have cell towers as often as we do. And it's, of course, if it can't find a cell, it doesn't work. Whereas we have frequencies that are really lower frequencies than that we use commonly in amateur radio. Now, this is probably one of the more common amateur radio devices. It's the always referred to as an HT, handy talkie, handheld radio. These things have become much, much more sophisticated. This radio here will do a number of things that can't be done by any of the other commercial types of devices. It's because of, you can look at the length of the antenna, is restricted, however, to the same sort of distance limitations that a cell phone or something else would be subjected to. This radio here will probably transmit reliably over a distance of 50 miles in terrain like western Pennsylvania here, unless it hits some hills. It'll go line of sight, pretty much depends on a lot of other things, but basically it's a 50-mile radio. Now, the analog to that, this is the one that you can carry with you, is a mobile radio. And this is the kind of a radio that we typically use in cars and gives us communications. And these radios are very much like the radios that the public service people would have had, the police departments, fire departments, and so forth, with one exception, and that is these are called analog radios. They're just kind of like the difference between the old cell phones and the new cell phones that are digital now. And we can talk a little bit more about digital transmission. This radio here is capable of going much, much longer distances around the world. It can transmit, just to compare wavelengths of signals. This device here, probably 2 feet would be a good representation of
2 feet.
the wavelength, and this radio can transmit a wavelength of about 180 meters, which is probably somewhere around 200 feet.
Yeah.
Just in round numbers, it gives you some perspective. So the longer the wavelength, the farther you can send the wave under certain conditions. And it all depends on the atmosphere. We get into a lot of different things with the atmosphere, with bouncing radio waves, even off the moon,
Propagation.
for that matter. And it's all considered propagation. So ham radio is the only real service that has that wide choice of distance-capable radios.
So what happens in a disaster situation? When you have a situation in which the normal phone lines, whether it be cell or wired, are down because of overload or they just fall down, why is ham still work, and what role does it play?
Well, best example I can give you is when we had the tornadoes in Birmingham last year. Among the things that got wiped out first were a 911 center, the hub of communications for a whole area, cell towers, and even at that, a cell tower generally has batteries, I'm told, that last about 4 hours, and then they're pretty much done. Ham radio, on the other hand, can communicate with just this radio. And it can find another radio. We have a standard call frequency, for example. If someone doesn't have access to a device called a repeater that really is a booster of signals, and someone could call on this radio on that frequency, and people in the surrounding area who are hams would know to listen to that frequency. And it's 146.520, and every ham probably knows that by heart. So they can communicate by voice in that way. And when we talk a little bit more about amateur radio communications, we can talk about our ability to send digital messages and long text kinds of messages as well. But as I said at the beginning, you just need the batteries to be charged in the radio and someone to know how to tune it, and you can get a signal out into the air, and if there's anybody out there that can hear it, they'll respond to you. Good example is every day, 7 days a week, there is a Maritime Mobile Net. People who are on ships, sailboats particularly, will have a ham radio, and hams monitor a certain frequency to listen for any calls or position reports, anything that those people at sea would like to report. And that's a real service to the maritime public as well.
So some of the most famous examples of when ham radio was critical, or recently in Katrina and in 9/11. Do you have any stories or anecdotes that you could share with us about 9/11 or Katrina?
Well, Katrina, of course, lost completely all of the infrastructure. They didn't have cell phones, they didn't have hardwired telephones, they didn't have even local public safety communications. And there were a few hams who were in the disaster scene, put out calls, and they were monitored. And as the situation progressed, more and more amateurs involved in emergency services converged on the Katrina area to set up networks of communication, some working in conjunction with organizations like the Red Cross, some with the public safety agencies, some with the military. There's one case I know that some people were evacuated from Tulane Hospital because the only form of communication they had was amateur radio. And they knew that they had a patient that was critical there and had to be airlifted out. They got priority to get that person evacuated. You mentioned 9/11. Probably the most exciting story of amateur radio on 9/11 was when the airplane hit the Pentagon. All communications were pretty much wiped out, and those communications that weren't wiped out were just clogged with people trying to use cell phones and so forth. The only means of communication between the Pentagon, the White House Situation Room, and the President was amateur radio for the first 15 minutes of that disaster in Washington, D.C. Met one of the fellows, he's Pennsylvanian, that happened to have been one of the hams involved, and it's a pretty exciting experience for him. And you know, it's reported in the FEMA logs and so forth, but not too many people hear about it. Amateur radio tends to be in the background, just doing the communications job, and people don't take much note of it.
Are there any famous people? Like you mentioned the president. I was wondering whether there were any famous ham operators.
Well, there are quite a few famous ham operators. Probably the most famous that, well, I'm not sure how many people now will recognize, but Walter Cronkite was a ham radio operator. And he really did quite a bit of ham radio operation. The astronauts are all ham radio operators. Those people that are serving on the International Space Station are all ham radio operators. A number of musicians are ham radio operators, kind of a natural thing. They're interested in the sound, they're interested in communication, and it becomes a really interesting hobby for them to give them somewhat of a diversion, but in things they know.
So you're saying that any ham could actually speak to an astronaut that's in space?
Absolutely. If they have their radio on, and they're pretty busy people, it's not like picking up the phone and calling them, but they do set up schedules, and one of the things that they really like to do, that hams participate in, is they like to talk to school kids, and they use ham radio as a way to communicate with the International Space Station when it flies overhead.
That's amazing. Well, I know that you brought a PowerPoint demonstration presentation for us to look at. Would you like to go through that?
Sure.
Okay.
It's just kind of a way to structure things a little better and give people as much of an idea as I can about the operations of the amateur radio service, especially related to Western Pennsylvania here.
Okay. So
the first thing, I guess, that I think I'd like to emphasize is that there are really quite a few other services involved. If you can look at the next slide here, this is the number of agencies, or the agencies that are involved that use amateur radio or amateur radio licensed people. For example, you have the Radio Amateur Civil Emergency Services, and that's RACES. That is really part of what used to be called the Civil Defense System, is now Homeland Security, and they're attached to the 911 centers and also to the Pennsylvania Emergency Management Agency. You have the military amateur radio services. Each branch of the service has its own group that provide amateur radio relaying to different parts of the military, and they, if they're licensed hams, they also can cross-band with us and listen on the frequencies we can transmit on, and we can listen on the frequencies they can transmit on, and we can exchange information that way. In fact, Armed Forces Amateur Radio Emergency Services Day is coming up in May.
now the military has, I assume, their own frequencies that are probably encrypted, as well as police and law enforcement.
They are now becoming more encrypted. Amateur radio is not allowed to encrypt. That is, all of the signals that an amateur puts out, they can be digital and not intelligible without some device, but they have to be able to be viewed, if you will, by anyone. You're not allowed to send secret codes, and that was, of course, a wartime kind of a rule. They didn't want amateur radio frequencies being used to pass intelligence information. So everything has to be pretty much above board. Other agencies, you have the Civil Air Patrol. Everybody pretty much knows about the Civil Air Patrol. They're part of the Air Force, and they're mustered when there's an aircraft down and they need a search group to see if they can find it. Of course, the Amateur Radio Emergency Services, and this is the big all-volunteer group that every ham can belong to, that doesn't require anyone to tell it to muster. Like RACES requires the emergency director or some political official to tell them that they can get on the air, and even then they have some restrictions. The Civil Air Patrol requires orders from the Air Force. So when you get into emergency services, the ARES group is the only one that really is very independent and can work on other things like public service events. And we have the Pittsburgh Marathon that's coming up here shortly, where amateur radio is a key to that kind of to all of the communications that are done in that public service event. The more recent entry into emergency services here in Pennsylvania is the auxiliary communication system. Now, when we start, this is an initiative under the Pennsylvania Emergency Management Agency, and what they are trying to do is establish stations that that have what they term cross-platform capability. We looked down here, looked at all of the various types of radio, the family radio services, kinds of things, the citizens band, if you will, amateur radio, general radio services, and you try to pull those all together with the governmental groups, with the RACES and so forth, and use that capability to assure, one, penetration, but also quick communication between agencies and passing emergency information from one place to another, so that you can get things taken care of as soon as you can. And again, one of the key purposes, if you would go to the next slide, is that amateur radio gets the message through. It's just as simple as someone's house. There are probably in the Pittsburgh area, I think, at least, I think it's upwards of 1,500 amateur radio operators. And I know that there are about 70 of them that are registered in the amateur radio emergency services. So getting amateur radio out there is one of the things that we promote. And in the next slide, I think I really am just reminding people that amateur radio emergency services is as old as amateur radio and now celebrating its 76th birthday. And that the little note on the side there is just the first publication that announced the amateur radio services, and the item circled at the bottom highlights the fact that the amateur radio services goal was to have at least one station in every town, so that there was some form of communication town to town. And in the next slide, I really have highlighted a couple of the purposes of amateur radio. The natural disasters, and I thought it was interesting to point out that Katrina is probably the most heralded of the amateur radio experiences, but we had a tornado that went through western Pennsylvania here not too long ago, last year as a matter of fact, and devastated quite a few areas. We had amateur radio operators that spotted that tornado before the Weather Service knew about it, before the television stations even knew about it, and reported it to the Weather Service.
Is that Skywarn?
That's Skywarn. And Skywarn is an area of the National Weather Service that trains individuals, or any citizen who wants to can go to a Skyview training program and learn to read the signs in the sky to see if bad weather is coming and how bad it might be, and report that information back to the Weather Service. Remember, those meteorologists sitting there with all of their sophisticated radar and so forth can't really see over the horizon. So if they want to extend their ability to provide warning about really bad weather, they have to have some people on the ground. Now, amateur radio provides that service of people on the ground. And so they've developed a radio station, an amateur radio station at the National Weather Service out here in Moon Township. And hams go there, and meteorologists will ask them to call out to some group that it knows it should be on the air listening to find out what's happening with the weather. And believe it or not, they used to keep lots and lots of old telephone books so they could call the local 7-Eleven store or something like that and ask them what's going on. But amateur radio has served that purpose quite nicely. And then we did talk about the Pentagon, so that was another thing that I'd mentioned. Now, amateur radio emergency services, if you look at the next slide here, in western Pennsylvania consists of, is part of this overall structure. There are 73 subdivisions of the United States called sections, and the sections have a section manager, and each section has someone like me, the section emergency coordinator. And The section emergency coordinator is responsible really for kind of organizing groups of amateurs and their times to be at certain places and training and so forth. In the Pennsylvania section, if you want to go to the next slide, you can see that the Pennsylvania section in the 4 colors here consists of the 33 western counties. And I put a slide in here of the distribution of amateurs within those counties, if you want to go to the next one there. And this is a distribution of all of the amateurs, some 370 within this area that have committed to participate in an emergency situation if called upon. And they, of course, volunteer not only their time, but they all have their own equipment. And this takes a tremendous burden off of the government. I don't know whether you've been involved maybe with a police department or fire department that's getting new radios, and those kinds of things really cost in the millions of dollars. If the country had to replace amateur radio with their own people and so forth, it would probably add another $1 trillion to the national debt. I don't know that for sure, but it certainly would be a phenomenal amount of money because I think in the United States you're talking about 720,000 amateur radio operators. So it's quite a big thing to replace. Now, we mentioned working with some agencies. In the next slide, I have a listing. It's probably pretty hard to read, but amateur radio actually through the Amateur Radio Emergency Services has what are called memoranda of understanding, or how are we going to work together agreements with quite a number of agencies. Among them, the American Red Cross, the Public Safety Communications Officers System, Salvation Army, the National Emergency Coordinators Council, Radio Emergency Action Teams, Skywarn, and more recently with Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, to really help us to understand what's going to be expected of us if an agency calls, and from the agency's point of view, what could they expect us to do. And one of the real good examples is the Red Cross that we can talk about a little bit later. Some of the activities that we can talk about in the next slide are the Skywarn activities. We have, I believe it is now 18 what we call nets. That is, groups of people who meet on local radio repeaters that will provide that local on-ground weather information to Skywarn. With the Red Cross, we help them mostly with sheltering. For example, with the drill that will be coming up this summer, and the Beaver Valley nuclear plant is required to conduct every 3 years, what they do is they evacuate the area around the plant. Those people who are evacuated have to go to a medical aid station. Once they're released and shown, in this case, not to have any radioactive contamination, then they're turned over to the Red Cross to be directed to a shelter. Well, you can imagine the confusion that can result when you have a whole area of people being evacuated and sent to shelters. There are families that have been separated perhaps and getting through the process that you want to get back together. The shelters themselves have to know how many people are coming, when they should expect them. The headquarters down here in Pittsburgh has to keep track of how the shelters are filling up and where they need specific supplies. Shelters need to be able to communicate back out to tell to the Red Cross to order supplies, maybe special medications, things like that for people that are going to be sheltered for a while. That's just an example of our Red Cross kinds of things. Salvation Army, we work with them, and when they come to aid in a disaster, they actually have their own group of amateurs they call Saturn. And that's the Salvation Army, forget what the acronym is now, but Saturn is the amateur radio Salvation Army. Our served agency relationships are pretty important to us, and that's one of the things that we talk about quite a bit. Just looking at the Red Cross map here in western Pennsylvania in the next slide, there you can see that this is an area that we cover just out of the Pittsburgh region, and the Red Cross is consolidating its regions now and is planning to put radios in their various chapter locations around the western part of the state here. And it's quite a big initiative, and ham radio is playing a larger part of that. I think I only have a couple of other things that I wanted to talk about, and I don't know when you want to do a break, but the next subject would really be digital communications. I mentioned that oftentimes the message that you want to get through has to get through with a great deal of precision. It consists of long terms, perhaps, that may not be familiar to the communications people, and you have to have some way of transmitting that efficiently. A good example that we'll simulate is, just because of this local area here, you recall that we had Hurricane Ivan come through, and it caused quite a bit of flooding in the Allegheny Valley. Well, one of the things that folks at St. Margaret's Hospital were worried about is, well, what if our hospital, which is pretty low-lying there, were flooded and the pharmacy was flooded and we needed a lot of replenished drug supplies? How would we get them? We know the helicopter can fly, that's not the problem, but we don't have a telephone, we don't have internet. How are we going to do it? And this is an area where drug names, as you know, can be very complicated. Not only that, but they have to be verifiable by the drug number. Well, with a system that amateur radio uses, here in western Pennsylvania especially, called the Narrowband Emergency Messaging System, we can actually send lists of things over the air with the same kind of precision, and it's very similar to sending a fax.
So we're going to have a demonstration of that after the break.
And we'll have a demonstration, and these two fellows here are really adept at that. They just love this digital stuff and computers, and it's right up their alley. So, and we got to get them to tell us a little bit more about why they get interested in ham radio and why it's something that is pretty good stuff for a lot more kids than sitting in front of the video games or the PC and looking at the internet and so forth.
Let's finish up with the slides and we can...
Okay. Well, this is how simple that digital communication system is. It relies on the computer's sound card. It will use a laptop computer, netbook computer, and one of the handheld radios in its simplest form, and you can complete some text on the computer and then turn the radio on and let the computer transmit the sound interpretation of the text that you put in, and that's sent over the air to another radio on the other side, and that radio listens and it will broadcast that information into the computer, and it's decoded on the other side. And of course it takes some special software on both sides to make it work. But it's just that simple, and this is a prime example of why amateur radio is so simple that it's not interrupted. Going back to the Pentagon, they have this kind of thing. They had it for years. The only thing is they got so addicted to their other more flashy forms of communication, they forgot where it was or it was sold or something that just wasn't there for them to use, but amateur radio was. And let's see, I think that just to give you an indication with one more thing here, and then I think we'll leave the slides. The next slide talks about a system that's called D-Star. Now D-Star is being introduced here into Pittsburgh. The North Hills Amateur Radio Club has a D-Star repeater, and University of Pittsburgh has a D-Star repeater, and there are several others. And with the D-Star communication system, the radio behaves much more like the cell phone. And it is actually a true digital mode. Instead of the voice being sent as a variation in frequencies and so forth, it's really sent as digital codes. And because of that, it can interface with the internet, with its own internet, and you can go just about anywhere with it. And when these guys get a chance to talk, maybe they'll tell you about Echolink, since that's a computer kind of thing that they really like.
Well, that's all fascinating. I think that we're going to take a break now, and then we're going to have a demonstration. We're going to have Jeff and Brian give us a little bit of a demonstration about how to use these technologies, and we'll be right back. Thank you. Welcome back. We're here now with two Pitt students, Jeff and Brian, and they're going to demonstrate for us a wonderful new technology, or maybe it's not so new. If you can just tell us what you're doing.
Well, we are going to be demonstrating the NBEMS, or Narrowband Emergency Messaging System. And what that is it's a software package. In this case, we're using FL Digi. And it's open source software, meaning it's free for everybody to use. And what you can do with it is you can send digital text or data over the air using amateur radio.
So you're going to be sending from your computer through your amateur radio, your handheld, to another handheld that's what distance away?
Well, in this situation, we're 3 or 4 feet. However, in the field, using VHF and UHF, very high frequency or ultra high frequency, which is what technician class amateurs will be using mostly. If you're going through some sort of radio repeater or signal booster, up to 70, 80 miles.
So 70, 80 miles away, there'll be another computer, and it will be receiving whatever text you're typing into your laptop. Okay, so let's see how that works.
Okay. All right. Well, I will be sending a radiogram, and in amateur radio world, a radiogram is a message sent by a radio for not just for amateurs, but amateurs can relay messages onto just regular people via telephone or via mail. It's lost its popularity, but it's coming back in digital. So I will do an auto send of this here using the program, and we're using a digital mode called MT63.
And my computer is beginning to receive Jeff's message. Once it is finished, it will do a checksum, meaning that it will check for any errors, and then it will automatically open his message into a web browser.
Message just is finishing up, and
checksum cleared, and there's the message saying ARL radiogram from Jeffrey Wolf, AB3LS, to myself.
So that was just a quick short demonstration there that you can send digital text using sound card modes. That's what we call them. Basically what's happening there is your sound card in your computer is converting the binary data, the digital data, into sounds that can be modulated, modulated is the term that I can't really think of another term right now, but converted into audio signals, which are then, audio signals in the voice range so that it can be adapted onto a device that uses, voice. So voice signals sent over the air, then his computer received it, decoded it using his sound card or a microphone input port, and his computer decoded it, recovered the digital data, and displayed the message that I sent to him.
Wow, that is very cool. And obviously this has all sorts of uses in a disaster situation. Some Larry explained to us a little earlier. I noticed that you have some other devices connected here, the GPS, or how does that work?
Yes, these particular radios that we have here in front of us employ a technology called Aprs, which stands for Automated Packet Reporting System. Now this is separate from NBEMS, it's not the same system. Aprs is a sort of a precursor to SMS messaging, if you can picture it in that light. It uses a protocol called AX25, and that stands for Amateur Packet 25, and it uses an early version of internet packets, actually, the internet packet structure. So it has a destination, a from address, has a checksum to verify whether the message was received correctly or not. But what's really interesting is that you can embed position information into that packet. So this radio here will do is it'll receive the GPS signal, calculate its position, put that into a packet, modulate it using a digital packet modulator, and send it over the air for anybody to pick up so they can see where I am. So it's a transponder of sorts.
So that could be used in search and rescue?
Yes, it can. Yes, it can. You could be sending your position out to rescuers. As a rescuer, you could listen for packets to see if you hear something from the person you're looking for. You can send text messages. You can physically send a text message to another amateur radio operator. So it's a system that actually has been around for about 20 years now. So it has, we've had text messaging for a long time now. It's just, in the commercial market, it's evolved to much higher capacity than we have as amateurs. But we're trying to keep it simple because whenever you add more, you lose that reliability.
So this technology could be used in any sort of environment, in the middle of the desert, at sea, on a mountaintop?
Yes, exactly. There's a worldwide, and one thing we wanted to talk about was linking the internet into everything. And APRS, the packet reporting system, is very closely tied into the internet. There's gateway stations which take the RF, or the radio side, and tunnel it into the internet and let it get into the internet so that traffic can move around the internet. If you look on the internet, a very popular website, you can view all of the APRS activity around the world, aprs.fi. If you view that map, it's a Google map and it has all of the APRS information overlaid. You can see the entire network of APRS, amateur radio.
FI being Finland.
Yes, it's a Finland-based site, but it works.
Finnish site.
It works really great. So.
Okay, and there was another technology that you wanted to discuss?
Echolink is a VoIP service. It's much like Skype, but without the video. So you can connect to any repeater system that is linked into Echolink via your computer and talk to anybody on those repeater systems. So for instance, if I want to talk to another university, such as the University of Michigan, I could use my computer to access their repeater system via the internet and talk to their club members during one of their nets or any other time of the day.
Now, why would you do that if you just have the internet anyways? Why don't you just type in your message in a ICQ or some sort of, on Facebook? Why would you use the Echolink?
Well, Echolink, it narrows it down to specifically who you're trying to find. So yes, you can use Facebook. Yes, you can use email or other sorts. But whenever you're looking for somebody that might not have access to the internet, such as a emergency due to a natural disaster. Whenever Hurricane Katrina came around, there really wasn't any internet down there. There weren't telephone lines, but there was amateur radio. What those amateur radios operators were able to do were use FL Digi like we just did, send a message through their Echolink repeater system to somebody maybe in a northern state, in Tennessee, Kentucky, that was able to compile those lists of injured, sick, what medicines were needed, what supplies were needed, send it to a nearby hospital. That list, they could send that by email if they had the internet at that hospital, and say, this is what's out there, this is what we need, this is what needs to be done. And that's how the hospital, the emergency services, were able to prepare themselves. So Facebook, yeah, it's an internet service, but whenever you don't have internet, what do you do? This is the next alternative.
That's what's great about amateur radio, is that you can adapt it in a sense that you can use the internet as a backhaul. You can change how much of the internet you're using at any one point in time. You could not use it at all. You could use it end to end, all the way. You could use it as a middleman to get audio from one repeater to another repeater, and then have radio in between the other users. So that's what's really great about the internet and amateur radio, is that you can really define how you want the internet to do what you want to do in amateur radio.
So you guys are part of, your students in the university, you're part of an amateur radio club there, the Panther
Amateur
Radio. How does one contact you if they want? What are your call signs? Let's start with that.
My call sign is AB3LS.
My call sign is KB3VKE.
And Larry, come over here. I mean, we forgot to get your call sign in case there's some ham radio operators out there that want to speak to you.
My call sign's AB3ER.
Okay, and my call sign is KB3VPY. And even though I'm new at this, I'm learning every day new things. I can see it's an incredible resource for everyone to have. Is there anything else that you guys wanted to speak about?
I just want to mention, it's rare to see young people in the hobby, and people ask me a lot, well, what entices you to get involved in a hobby that's so old-fashioned? Well, yes, there's parts that are old-fashioned. There's a lot of older operators that, that is, yeah, I'm sorry, Larry. I'm sorry. I know.
What's that older stuff?
Yeah. Anyway, but there is so much you can learn about modern communications, modern telecommunications from amateur radio, because, Larry touched on this earlier. Every modern telecommunication system out there is based on amateur radio somehow. And just going back and taking a look at what our forefathers of communication designed 100 years ago, you can really learn about how today's systems work and how to make them better, just by looking back at that fundamental technology and thinking about how to apply it even more.
Mm-hmm. And you don't have to be an engineer, and you don't have to understand the math and the science that goes into it. You're new. Jeff and I are relatively new. I've been at this a year. Jeff, you've been
Year and a half,
and this is what we've learned. By the time we're experienced, such as Larry, 50-odd-some years into the field, there's going to be so many more technologies available and so much more that we can do with this. The possibilities just go on and on. So that's why we are interested in it, because we believe that this is the future. You can learn so much from this, and you can begin to invent so many more things using the basics that you learn in amateur radio.
The past, the present, and the future. It's wonderful. Well, I want to thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
I want to thank Brian and Jeff and Larry, of course, 73s. And I want to thank PCTV for letting us use their studio. And thank you for joining us today at the Prepper Report. and letting us bring you additional segments in the future on other topics of emergency preparedness. Please feel free to contact us on our email. It's prepperreport@gmail.com, prepperreport@gmail.com. I'd love to hear your suggestions if you have any, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you very much.